The fantasy genre is known for its villains. We have some of the most iconic antagonists and villains across pop culture. So today I thought we would go over 10 trends for fantasy antagonists that we just need more of. The first one, we have natural forces / dark lords. Some of the most iconic villains in all of fantasy are, of course, the more classics like Sauron from Lord of the Rings. However, with this more modern fantasy, there is a trend to make them more human, to make them more morally grey and ambiguous and just more complicated as a human being, which I do really enjoy. However, I do also like having the malicious force of nature that is the Dark Lord, and just having this kind of unknown aspect to their motives and their being, because they're not human. They've been about forever and they have some sort of ingrained ideas that are just incomprehensible to us as people, because they are this nature that's just baked into the world. And I'd just love to see more of that type of antagonist in a story as well. Now, of course, this does complicate things from sort of a character arc standpoint or things like that, because they're harder to write. It's not really that compelling to just face off this big bad that just happens to be there doing evil. But there's lots of other ways that you can turn that into an interesting antagonist and reflect it with the character and their arc and why they have to overcome this evil. It's something I'm kind of playing with in my series, the Shadowbinders trilogy, with Harbinger of Justice being the first book, second the Black Mantle. The main antagonist of the series is this more force of nature that equally acts as a window into the past and kind of explains why the world is how it is. So it's something that I just really, really enjoy and I'd love to see more of. As always, I'm not saying this doesn't exist. Of course it exists, and I've probably read some of them as well. I just want more of these things. That being said, if you do have any recommendations that fit some of these prompts, I would love to hear them in the comments below. Next up, we have the downward spiral. So often the antagonist is evil from the start. That's usually the kind of typical setup. However, I really like when the downward spiral of a good person becomes the antagonist at the length of the story. It's just a really good way to bake in the emotions and the motives into the antagonist, because you can see where they're coming from, because you can follow the arc through the book of this downward spiral into becoming the main antagonist. I don't know if it's just really messed up, but I just love downward spiral arcs for characters. I think it's a great way to create a villain that's just really compelling. And this is definitely one I don't see enough of, especially if there's some sort of betrayal, or you can see this breaking of these two friends, because then you just get, there's so much emotional impact to him becoming the villain or her becoming the villain, because perhaps they came from the same place, they were close, and it's just this breaking, and perhaps from things that are just completely out with their control, that's more to do with how they are treated and how they're separated. There's so much you can do there to just break a reader's heart that as a writer has me so excited. But also as a reader, because I love that type of thing. The horror movie approach. Now this is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, because I do think there's multiple ways to do villains that all work depending on the story that you want to tell. And I think this is an underrated and underutilized trend with fantasy villains. And this is something that's really common in horror films. And it's to do with keeping the antagonist villain unseen. If we don't see them, they still become this unknown force. A couple years ago, I was on a panel with Ed McDonald and Rob J. Hayes and some other people as well at TBRCon, and we were discussing fantasy creatures. And Ed McDonald is a very talented writer, and he was talking about this idea of having this horror movie approach of when you see the monster in a horror film, it's no longer that scary. You know what it looks like. It becomes this thing. Whereas if you keep it in the dark, it's still this unknown force that could be anything. And that is the most terrifying part of the movies. And he said that is often how he approaches creating these very terrifying fantasy creatures. But I also think it's applicable to things like fantasy antagonists. If we just see the devastation that they can leave and hear the stories of what they do, it just makes them this unknown, terrifying force. And there's something really powerful in that. Different species. Another thing that can make your villains very unpredictable and terrifying is to have them as a different race or species. This way is so much harder for the reader and also the protagonist to know what this species values are like, what their morals are like. They might completely be uncomprehending on what being a human is like. I think this is something that the Sun Eater series, first book being Empire of Silence, did really, really well. It was fascinating to learn more about the Sealson and just how different they are from people. Hadrian goes in being very optimistic about working with the Sealson. Very quickly, it becomes apparent how difficult it is to barter with them and understand them because their society and their social norms are so different. The other thing is we get a lot of human villains. We get the person in the black suit and the slick back black hair that gets to twirl his mustache. However, it's rare to have the complete horrors of the world, the eldritch monsters, the Cthulhu-like beings that are just absolute nightmares and look better suited to a From Software game like Elden Ring, and I would love to see more of that. The antagonist being a good guy. When we get down to what an antagonist is, it is someone who is stopping the protagonist, the main character, from achieving some sort of goal or get to some point where they want to get to. And we often have it in our heads that the antagonist is just the villain of the story, the enemy, the evil. However, I'd really like to see more where the antagonist is the good guy in that situation. And perhaps we are following the villain trying to achieve their goals, and the antagonist is the one that's trying to do the good. And what I find really interesting with this as well is you can kind of subvert the expectation in the story. So right from the start, you can build up this narrative from the protagonist's standpoint and make it seem like the antagonist is evil. And then at the end, you can do that switch and show that, okay, actually, if you're standing back, the protagonist is really the villain of the story, despite the fact that he is the protagonist. This also moves really neatly into the next point, which is good people versus good people. So aside from that, another thing that's really interesting is having both the antagonist and the protagonist being good people. This is where we get into the more morally grey antagonists and also protagonists, because if they're both fighting for something that's good, it's the reader that needs to decide which they feel like is the better option, better outcome for the world, aside from these two characters. Because if they're both fighting for something that makes sense and is subjectively good, it makes it really interesting to know who should we root for? And can there be a true winner out of this situation? Or no matter what, is one of them going to become the villain by taking out the other good person, even if they have all these good motives backing them? Creative motives. Building off that last point, I would love to see more creative motives with our villains. Quite often, it's some sort of very straightforward, typical motive, and a lot of the time there's nothing wrong with the motive, and it can really work within the narrative, especially like revenge stories. It's pretty typical, but it's often such a good time and just works well for the story and the characters involved. There's nothing wrong with it. However, I do think having more creative motives and more creative reasons for them doing this evil and this antagonizing, I think could make for a really interesting story. And it's something that isn't that common to see in fantasy. Often we have the very typical reasons, but I'd love to see more weird and creative reasons as to why they are doing what they're doing. Especially with big epic fantasy, we have the page space and we have the type of narrative where we can flesh things out like that. So if you have some sort of antagonist that perhaps have been manipulated into believing something that's not true, or just that they have a really unique look at the world through a very unique lens because they were brought up in some special place or in some special situation, that they just have more knowledge than perhaps even the protagonist because they've seen this darker side of the world that they perhaps don't agree with and want to rebel against, and the protagonist doesn't even know that this stuff is going on. Motives that you can then tie into the plot and make the antagonist more interesting from. I've ordered these really well because this next point again builds on this point. Villains that have a life. I have read a lot of fantasy that lean into, we come across the villain when they're doing evil. We find them on a battlefield and they're killing lots of people, and that's great. Or they're invading another country, or they're holding people captive and they're doing an evil monologue, which is fine, but often makes them very one-dimensional. If you are trying to create a very complicated antagonist, again, depending on the story, I do think the more Dark Lord also works. But if you are trying to make this more complex antagonist, I want to see their life out with them doing evil, What does it look like when the eviling is done, when they have won the battle, when they are just about to go into battle, when they are planning out their battle plans, or who do they speak to? What do they spend their free time doing? I want to see that the villain exists outside of just fulfilling the idea of evil within the narrative. Pantheon of Gods. Now, I love a Dark Lord, this sort of powerful being that's kind of wanting to rule the world. However, it feels rather disconnected often to the story and the narrative and the main characters. But if you have a pantheon of gods and you can kind of have this dynamic between each other, this founding of the world, or why the world is a certain way, or even just other characters with the same sort of level of ability and power as your main antagonist, it just creates for a more interesting dynamic. It's something we see a lot in mythology that I really, really like, such as Greek mythology. The Pantheon of Gods with Zeus and Hades and everything is always really interesting. Same with more of a pagan Viking mythology with kind of Odin. Super interesting, and I love when different authors do pull from that. It also just creates a more natural way for the antagonist to have motive. Why does he want to destroy the world? Oh, because he's angry at the person who created it. It also just opens a lot of opportunity to show kind of their personality out with their destructive behaviors. And last but most certainly not least, we have minor villains. Now, of course, most fantasy books have the big bad, the big evil that we get to defeat at the end of the final book. However, having these more minor villains that are spaced throughout the story is just a really good way to tie into the themes or the character arc. Perhaps each villain kind of has an aspect that directly relates to something that the main character needs to overcome. And it also just creates this really good sense of progression if we go through the story, knocking off these more minor villains before we reach the big bad itself. So let me know down in the comments below, what are some of your favorite fantasy or sci-fi antagonists? I'd love to hear them, and also just any recommendations that kind of fit into some of the prompts on this video. And if you want to see something similar, I did a video talking about 10 underrated trends I'd like to see with magic, so check that out here. Thank you very much for watching. Outro. Now, I do say good guy and bad guy a lot in this video, just to specify they don't need to be male. This was just a generic term to use to get the point across.